Hello and welcome to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Ram Tuli. This podcast is about the joy of guitar. That includes buying guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars. We're talking vintage guitars, new guitars, used guitars, pre-war, flat tops, electric Spanish arch tops, custom shop guitars, limited edition guitars, basses, amps, effect pedals, lap steels, mandolins, banjo. If it has strings, we're going to talk about it. I've spent most of my life studying the vintage guitar market. It's truly something I love and I'm passionate about. I can talk guitars all day, and I'm going to. Hello, everybody. I'm with my friend Tommie James. Tommie and I are probably the two biggest fans of Fender amps. I don't think anybody knows more about Fender amps than us. Well, I'm being facetious there, but everything I know about Fender amps, I learned from you, Tommie. You and David Hunter, and that's why when I was doing this podcast, I wanted you. You know, you and I have been talking Fender amps for years. So why not continue that conversation? And today we're going to just talk about the most important Fender amps ever built and what the marketplace really ranks these by how much people have to pay for them now. So how you doing, Tommie?
I'm doing great. And by the way, let me clarify for those that are interested and wondering, I am not Tommie James with the Shondells. That's the first question I get meeting new people, but I am a longtime musician and I'm a fan of the Shondells. Never got to meet that gentleman with the Shondells, but I've loved his tunes and over the years, and I've been in a band for most of my life. It's just coincidental.
So what was the very first Fender amp that you owned?
It was a 1965 F6A Bassman.
And you used that. You weren't a guitar player, though. You were a keyboard player.
That's correct. In school, in high school, everybody played guitar. Well, I couldn't afford one, but I had piano lessons, and that was tradition in my family. And so I knew how to play piano. And so when we started our first little band, four of us, two played guitar. We didn't even have a bass player, and I was on keyboards.
Mm-hmm. And you played through the Bassman, or did your guitar player also play through that Bassman?
No, that Bassman came about by the need for volume. I couldn't keep up with the noise the other two guys were making. So I rented that Bassman from a local music store to play the gigs. Mm-hmm. I'd rent it on Friday afternoon, take it back on Monday. And after I had done that for a few months, the owner suggested, he said, Tommie, you keep renting this thing. Why don't I just put it in the back, and when you have paid me the sale price, you can own it. Mm-hmm. It took me 2 years to pay for it, but that's how I came about my first amp.
And that was an amp. And then you told me you replaced that with a 4x10 concert after that, right?
Yep, got a concert amp. It turned out to be a 61 and 410s that still had the Alnico magnets. Mm-hmm. And those handsome spaghetti logo covers on it. Mm-hmm. And, of course, and that amp had tremolo as one of the new features. And
right.
But brown and wheat grill, and I still have that amp to this day.
It's safe to say that you've been a Fender amp guy most your playing life.
Absolutely.
So one of the things when we're talking about Fender amps, you've amassed a collection, probably one of the best collections for as far as high quality, you know, basically 100% original, cosmetically perfect, which is very hard to do when it comes to old Fender amps. You had at one time amassed and had a huge collection. And I believe 9 of your amps have appeared in Vintage Guitar Magazine in the Dave Hunter featured articles.
That's correct. The most recent one was featured in November of 2023. And it happened to be a Bassman, a very rare Bassman, as it turns out. It was a head that was in a unusual color for the time. The brown,
right,
had been more of a mid-60s thing. Mm-hmm. But there was a different version of the brown that came out sometime in 1965 with a gold sparkle grill.
Right.
And the cabinet didn't have a speaker cabinet, but I was interested in the head because it was a very rare model 6G6C.
Right. And that was in the brown Tolex, not black Tolex.
That's correct.
And what year what was the date stamp on that?
It was March of 64.
64. So that's a crazy anomaly. That's one of the things when you collect Fender amps, you're going to have anomalies all over the place. People say, Leo Fender never threw anything away. Leo Fender used everything he had. You find things that aren't supposed to exist that exist, tweed that covered things that come out in 64, 65. So that's what, when people say, well, that doesn't exist. Well, that's true an awful lot when it comes to Fender amps. That amp shouldn't exist, but it does, because everything you could imagine was done.
We're not sure, but it possibly a special order,
right?
And we'll never know the answer to that. I happened to see it in a marketplace ad one night and thought, well, this is unusual, but he had pictures of the chassis, so I knew it was a real deal. And the price was right, so I bought it.
Okay. So we'll talk about that amp a little bit later. One of the things that we've noticed about Fender amps right now is that the price is at an all-time high for most amps. That's just been happening in the last 5 years. Fender amps are pretty consistent. They stay about the same price. And then once the COVID pandemic thing started, prices of all vintage gear started going up, and Fender amps started really going up. And as a result of that, most of the Fender amps that most of us that collect Fender amps, they're at all-time high right now as far as what people have to pay in order to get to them. So we're going to keep that in mind as we go forward. One of the things I got to do is I got to just get some just Ampology 101 and just remind everybody, we're not going to get into the detail. We're not going to get into the circuits. So the one thing I'll just say is that unlike an audio amplifier, which reproduces and enlarges a signal in a components and circuitry that minimizes total harmonic distortion, the guitar amp is basically a low-fidelity signal processor. And nobody did this better than Leo Fender as far as low-fi, low-fidelity signal processing. And it's basically its job, this Fender amp, its job was to allow an otherwise non-resonant plank of wood with steel strings to produce a sound. And the guitar and amplifier in a Fender instrument is considered the same instrument. Leo Fender built this amp and this guitar together. And that's why 50s Stratocasters and Telecasters sound best in the 50s amps. The 60s Strats and Tele sound better in brown amps. The late mid-50s or mid-60s stuff sounds greatest in the black panel stuff. So that's important to understand that Fender guitar and the amplifier are considered one instrument. And that's why people that like me who are Fender aficionados, we always notice that. And another basic thing about amplifiers is that the amplifier's function is basically just to influence how the amp's regulated DC output drives an output speaker. Everything we do with that string is basically influencing the signal that goes through it. And it's basically that DC power supply. And now we're going to talk about the different amps as we go. I guess the bottom line is that the signal caused by your vibrating guitar string is affected and colored by every component in that amplifier, including the ones that the signal doesn't even pass through. And that's the DC regulator, supply, and rectifier. And I think that's one of the most important components and what really sets some of these amps apart. Do you prefer 6V6 amps or do you prefer the Fender 6L6 amps, Tommie?
6L6. I prefer those, and I've even gone to a 5881, which Fender never used stock. They last longer, and they sound the same as a 6L6.
How would you compare the basic sound of a 6V6 amp compared to a 6L6 amp?
Well, I'm thinking a little thinner with the 6V6 and a little thicker with the 6L6.
I think David Hunter describes it best when he says that the 6V6s are juicy, well-rounded, smooth, and you get a rich distortion from that tube itself. And the 6L6s give you a bold, firm, low end, prominent highs. That's why those two type of amplifiers are completely different. If you play through a small 6V6 amp, usually you're basically under 20 watts because those 6V6s are low output power. And the 6L6s are going to be over 30 watts. And that's where you get your headroom and your loudness. And that's kind of like what separates the little amps from the big amps, right?
Yep.
And another thing is, when we talk about these amplifiers, it's also very important to the fact that what makes the old Fender amps so desirable was the harmonics, the odd and even harmonics that came out of the different stages. And according to Nick Grabian, he tells us that if you're talking about bloom and thickness and sag and compression, those are the even harmonics and usually derived in the preamp sections. And if you're talking about the crunch and the drive and the treble boost, it's the odd harmonics, and the power that really comes from the power section. And the first amp, the most important amp, the most expensive Fender amp you can buy right now is the amp that does both of those perfectly. And that's the high power twin, the 5F8. Have you ever owned one of these amps?
No, never have even seen one. Never seen one or heard one that I'm aware of. But there's one of those is for sale right now online,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure that Fender amp people have discovered it. I don't see it on your. Well, yes, you got it on your list here.
Yeah, it's number one. It's this to me is what I consider the highest priced Fender amp right now. And just to get one that's in just cosmetically, doesn't matter what cosmetic shape it's in, as long as it's clean, fully functioning, has all the original iron, it's going to cost you well over $20,000.
Yeah.
Most people have to pay much more than that. And that kind of, I don't have one in my collection mainly because where would I ever play one? How would I ever, where would I play it? I would never be able to turn it up anywhere. I'd break windows, so that's kind of a thing. And as far as an investment, these amps have incredible investment returns. They earn about 5 to 6% annually as far as collector. If you keep it, you're gonna get a return about 5 to 6%, which is incredible for. But this is like we were talking, I think, a couple of days ago, that you just don't see these, and if you do see them, they're usually gobbled up pretty quickly by somebody who's a big star, and just wants to have it in his collection. I believe this one actually came with 588 ones, right?
5881s. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yep. And this was a fixed bias. This was an 80-watt amp, 1957. Imagine having 80 watts. People could fill ballrooms, and people could hear them with the bassman. Can you imagine with 40 more watts what that must have done, what that must have felt like? This one here it uses, I think the bassman and this amp were the first two to use the long-tailed phase inverters, which are cleaner, give you more power, and they use the P12Ns. And it's weird, those P12Ns, they're only rated for about 60 watts, right?
Yes.
So here,
I think that's right.
So I guess Leo Fender never intended for you to play that 80 watts for a very long time.
Nope.
You would have destroyed those speakers quickly. In fact, I know that, I know the people that use these high-powered twins in concert, they're continuously replacing the speakers. They put the Celestians in there, and they completely, I think after 40 shows, they have to replace them because those things just destroy speakers.
Yeah, they didn't have JBLs yet.
Not yet. Okay, so the next one that shows up on the list as far as the most valuable is then the low-power twin. This is the 5D8A, and this one is a 40-watt. It basically has two less 5881s, and it also has fixed bias, but it also has the cathodiene phase inverter, which is something I love in a thing, and it uses two rectifiers because Leo at this time was actually understanding that the rectification was how you get loudness. It's really from that rectifier. And this is an amp. Have you ever owned a low-power twin?
No, I don't believe I have.
Okay, I have a low-power twin, great amp, but the truth is, and I'm going to say this in all honesty, there were three amps that kind of had the same circuitry in them that used that same basic layout as far as 6L6, the 30, 40 watt range. It was the low power twin, the Bandmaster, and the Super and the Pro 5E5. Out of those amps, you've had quite a few of all those amps, right? The 6L6 Tweed narrow panels.
Yes.
What was your favorite out of those narrow panel 6L6 amps?
Well, of course, the Tweed had 410s. Concert has had 410s. Looking through my list here.
The Bandmaster, out of all these, Bandmaster was always my favorite. Nothing even compared to that. Even I don't think I even like the Bandmaster over the Bassman. And there's something magical about being able to get all that at 30 watts, at a low volume.
Now, I've owned a couple of those. I think you might have one of them.
Yes, I do. I have quite a few of your stuff right now. So yeah, the Bandmaster 5E7 is, I think, people always ask me in my collection, what is my favorite amp? What's the best amp overall? It's that Bandmaster 5E7, 59 Bandmaster. And it's just, there's something about it. There's just something about the fixed bias cathodiene PI inverter that has the same output transfer as the Super. So there's a mismatch there, which causes I think a lot of that magic to happen. And that's good. And it's interesting to note that the Bandmaster 5E7 was quickly replaced by the 5G7, which was the brown center volume version of the 3x10. You own both of those, and those are both made 6 months apart, but they're completely different amps. And I think that amp really showcases the change from the narrow band or narrow panel to the brown circuitry. And that is really showcased in those two amps, how different they really were.
310 Bandmasters were, I guess they didn't make very many. I don't know about production numbers, but they're pretty rare.
Right.
And one of my favorite amp techs is a guy named Steve Hunter, and he apprenticed under Michael Clark. And Michael was my sound guy in my band back in the 80s. And he was tinkering with vintage amps, and he understood the circuits and what needed to be done, to bring one back to life, so to speak, that had never been serviced. He was after me for a long time before I let him service, as they call it, that concert amp. Mm-hmm. And he brought it back to life. So right then I was decided that he knew what he was doing. And a fellow from Texas named Steve Hunter, he actually apprenticed under Michael and learned the vintage amp technology and opened up his own business in Athens, Georgia, where he is still to this day. So those two guys have heard most of my vintage amps and have worked on them. And I like to ask them to rate them.
Right.
And which of my amps have you worked on that you like the best? And that 310 Bandmaster wins that question. Mm-hmm. So it's everything that you described. In addition to being very rare, you just don't hardly ever see one anymore.
Right. It's important to point out that in the guidebook, the price guide, the Bandmaster is about the same price as a Bassman from that same era. But I contend that if you have the money and you can get either or, I would go after that Bandmaster always. The Bassmans come and go, but the Bandmasters are so hard to find, and they will literally blow your mind. One thing I forgot to mention is that about 10 years ago, actually a little while, probably less than that, my band, we put together an album it was a project. It was called the Naked and Dime Project. I wanted to learn about these amps. And the best way to do it, I thought, was to record with 14 of them. And we put together an album. Those tracks are all isolated. They're on a website. I'll give the link. It's nakedanddime.com. And you can listen to all that. And you will hear, because we've isolated every time that Bandmaster was used, you can hear it. It'll blow your mind how different, how great that amp sounded. And then we also, I think I isolate out the 6E7 or 6G7, and you can hear it's a completely different amp. It's a very clean, has so much headroom that you're not going to get it to distort, and that changes your perception depending on the kind of music you play. So, but before we leave that, so about $10K, you can get the Bandmaster or the Bassman. Also coming close there is now the Super, the 5E4, the one that's got 6L6, and I always tell you, if you can find one, get it. You might be able to get that for a little under 10. But there's a gem. There's something very special about the Pro, the 59 Pro 5E5, which has the very same circuitry, but it has a 1x15 speaker in it. That one you could actually get for about half that price. But that amp will blow your mind. You know that Pro very well.
Yes, and currently I still have a 6G4 Super, and it's a 1960 model. Mm-hmm. Did you end up with one of those 5E or?
Yeah, I have the Pro that you bought that was immaculate.
Oh yeah, okay.
And remember, in fact, you should tell that story, how you came across that particular 59 immaculate 5E5.
Well, one day I got a phone call from a lady who lives near here. Camden, South Carolina is a relatively small town, so but she lived in the country, and she said, I understand that you know something about Fender amplifiers. And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, I've got one here that my husband played back in the 50s. Said he and some of his buddies had a little country band country music band, and said he passed away a few years ago. He said that band didn't last long. Said they didn't play much, but she said it's in a closet in my foyer, and it's so heavy I can't move it. And I said, would you come and help me? Gave me directions, and I drove out to the house and removed that amp from the closet. And Bill, you just won't believe it. It looked like the day it came from the factory. Original cover, and I took the cover off, and it was spotless. I mean, It's got this beautiful 15-inch Jensen, and I was astounded. And I said, well, where would you like me to put it? And she said, well, actually, I would like to sell it. And I said, well, let's get together on a price because I'd like to buy it. And I did. And I don't remember exactly what I paid for it, but she had no idea. But I gave her a fair price. Took it to Michael Clark, and he serviced it. And the fact that it looked so brand new, I mean, how many times are you ever going to see one after so many years? Well, I went to pick it up, and I said, how does it sound? He said, oh, it sounds great. And I said, well, let's hear it before I put it in the car. He put it up on the bench and plugged it in. The third chord, and that speaker cone came apart. It was so old and deteriorated that it just couldn't take it anymore, which was actually a good thing because I got it reconed, and now it sounds wonderful.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was a rare.
Right. And I'll point out to everybody that there's pictures of that amp in the Naked and Dime book. We took a lot of pictures. It's what a Fender amp looked like the minute it left the store. It was pristine. And I broke in that speaker. I mean, we used that on the album, and that was I think I even called you the day in the studio and said, you got to hear this amp. This thing is, and you told me that's probably the first time it's been played in 60 years. But that thing,
that's true.
And we featured that prominently on that album, and you can hear the isolation on that 5E5. And to me, that 5E5 is actually, when I think about the 6L6 narrow panel tweeds, that one is up there, even though it's about half the price of the Super or the low power twin. But to me, that just the 15-inch speaker just gives you such a high and low. Just the mids are just perfect, scooped and perfectly done. And it's really out of those amps that I have, I use that one a lot. And I'm not afraid because I know the speaker's been reconed. I can play it hard. I can play it. It's just a completely an incredible sounding amp. So I love that amp.
Well, I'm glad that it went to you. And, speakers, that particular situation indicated to me that reconing a vintage speaker is not a bad idea.
No.
I mean, even if it works, because, if you want to play it hard, or you're holding back because, well, I just don't want to blow that speaker, well, what's it worth blown?
Right. And the thing too is, like, if you're going to have a vintage amp and you're going to play vintage amp, the really, really high end vintage guitars usually wind up behind glass cases on the wall, and nobody buys an amp to put it on the wall and display it. If you buy a vintage amp, you're playing it and you love this tone you're getting out of it, and you're going to play it. A vintage amp, you have got to maintain it. This is a high voltage instrument, right? We're talking, you're talking millivolts for the guitar, but you're talking high voltage. You're talking big voltage, and you have to maintain these things. So anybody is selling you a vintage amp and he has not changed the electrolytic capacitors out, there's going to be a problem because those things should have been replaced 30 years ago. You're going to destroy it. And the speakers now, there is no more penalty, really. I personally don't penalize anybody in the guidebook by reconing speakers. As long as you have the original bell, it's got everything you need. If you replace the speaker, that's a whole different story. But if you keep the original bell and you recone it properly by somebody who knows what they're doing, that amp retains its essence. So that's very important. Don't be afraid to recone. Do not be afraid, and do not be afraid to change out those electrolytic capacitors.
I agree with that 100%. It took me a number of attempts at getting speakers reconed that I liked the sound of after they were broken in, when I got them back. because you have to choose between a smooth cone or a ribbed cone.
Hmm.
You can choose the voice coil power, and I've reconed enough of them now that, if I'm going to get it done, I have my favorite place to go in my formula, I call it.
Hmm.
And I'll usually up the power rating with the voice coil. And, 20, 30 watts was a lot of power back when they were
Right.
first made.
The ones that had the ribs on them didn't really appear until about 56, right? So if you're going to be historically accurate, you have to be very mindful of the paper that's used, right?
That's true. I think that Pro actually had a smooth cone.
Right.
But the 10s, I've done a lot of 10s and 12s, only occasionally a 15. And I do all of those with ribbed cones and at least 30 watts of power. I'll do 50, if the amp is more powerful. But yeah, I don't hesitate to upgrade, I'll call it,
Hmm.
with a new cone.
Right. And as far as also the one thing that you and I both do is we put on the 3-prong grounded plugs.
Absolutely.
And that's I see people a lot of times say, well, it's all original, still got the two-prong plug, and you're like, okay, don't grab anything while you're plugged into that thing. So that's
For sure.
yeah. So now let's go. Now we get to the Bassman. So we're still about $10,000. We're talking $10,000. Somebody's going to have to pay for an amp, an old vintage amp. But this is one that if you don't have a Bassman 5F6A in your collection, you really don't have a collection as far as I'm concerned. This is the amp. I think more has been written about this amp than any other amp in the history of guitar amps.
Well, and I think you're right. And they deserve their great reputation and price, because if you can find one, even if it needs work, it's one of the all-time favorites.
Now, from an investment standpoint, what you pay for a Fender Bassman today is about what you paid for a Fender Bassman 5-10 years ago. The price really doesn't change. I think it has a 3% annual return, which makes it, it's not, you could do better buying anything else and investing in anything else. But if you don't have a Bassman, you don't have an amp collection as far as I'm concerned. And that, to me, this is like an amp that everybody should have. You should have it in your den, have it in your family room, have it, you're not going to gig with it. Well, maybe you will. But it's an incredible amp and nothing sounds like it. Nothing. I love the Bassman sound. And it's a blues amp. And you think about all the songs that were recorded on a Bassman. How many concerts were seen with a Bassman everywhere? Everybody playing through a Bassman.
Well, I agree. It's my all-time favorite, but I'm glad for the other ones that I have come across, because I learned something from each one of them. And even in the restoration, well, most people say servicing, and I understand the need for up-to-date electronics. And I don't think it hurts the value at all. I think it protects the value, and you can play it and enjoy it for Pete's sake.
Right.
Looking at them gets old.
Right. Now, as far as Bassmans, do they all sound very similar, or are they all completely different sounding to you? Because you've owned quite a few. You've had quite a few.
Well, side by side with a critical ear playing with the same instrument, I can hear the difference. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's the speakers. As a matter of fact, most often it's the speakers, and followed by the tube selections that you've used, because that makes a difference in the sound.
Right. 5881s sound much, much better than 6L6s, no doubt about it.
Yep.
In that particular topology amp. I know you told me about the best sounding Bassman you've owned. Could you tell me that story again?
Let me think. I think that's the one you ended up with.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, well, I have a list, and that one was not the original one that I rented to own. That
right.
was a nice one that came along later, and I can't remember if I had the speakers reconed or not.
You did. These were reconed. I know. I remember you said they were the best P10Rs you'd ever found.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's just got the combination of things with the circuit, the tubes, the speakers, and of course the type of instrument that you're playing it through. It all adds up to whatever you like about it.
One thing I like to point out is that like we're not really talking about the circuitry in these things. Richard Kuhnel has written 2 books that I read from cover to cover often. And one was the guitar electronics in a bassman, and he compares it. He has a book about the Fender Deluxe. And these are must reads if you're really into the circuitry. Like you really want to learn what makes what. I direct anybody to these 2 books who really wants to learn, but it's really the combination of all these things that add up to a great amp. And that's the Fender amp. It has everything in it. If you were going to sit down and design this thing, I don't think you could. You couldn't design it to be that. It's just a serendipitous thing. Leo Fender sat down, did this, and it turns out it's like almost like the Telecaster and the Broadcaster. It's just perfect from the get-go. And the same thing with some of these narrow panel amps. They really were perfect from the get-go. And there are small iterations like they do toward the 58, 59. They start changing little things here and there, which are kind of like the apex of that model. And then everything changes and they go into that Brown circuit. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, the next most expensive amp, this is still about $10,000. It's the wide panel twin that came out in the mid 50s, which was the D circuit. That could cost you about $9,500 or 9.5K. This one is an amp that is a very unique amp. Have you ever had one of these amps?
Nope.
And this is really old. This is like where old meets new for the first time. You know, it's still cathode biased. It's got 6 L6s. I think this is the first amp that he uses negative feedback of presence control in, but it still uses the original Paraphase PI, which is kind of crazy. And you got 25 watts out of that thing, and he uses 2 rectifiers here for the first time. And that's a great amp. This is a cathode. This is really where the cathode follower tube stack starts showing up. But if you can get this or a Bandmaster or a Bassman, you know, I would take that money and apply it more to the Bandmaster or the Bassman before I bought the wide panel twin.
Is that the 5D?
Yes, the 5D8. Yep.
Okay. I've never seen one of those in person.
Yeah, they're hard to find, but I do see them, and people do ask much more than what they're really worth, and they sit. You know, if somebody asks way above, it's just if you ask more than what you ask for a Bandmaster or a Bassman, it's just going to sit. You really have to sell it under the price point. Has to be a little under the Bassman for it to move. But it's a great amp. It's a great Fender historical amp.
Forgive me. Let's go back to that Pro. Is that the one that the cabinet had been cut in half and made in?
No, that was the Bassman.
Basement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Michael Clark put together a new cabinet for it and put it all back together.
That one had a pristine circuit.
Cleanest circuit I've ever seen.
Nothing had ever been changed. It was like that Pro, you know, like that 56 Pro from the lady in the country. Pretty rare to ever see one like that.
Yep.
And I remember Michael wanted to keep it. He wanted to experiment. Well, you know, he's come out with his own line, his own version of that amp under his name Clark. And he tried everything he could buy new. He compared it to that one that you have, and he couldn't get it exactly. He couldn't do. There was always something about it that was not the same.
Yep, it was a combination of everything. It just added to something brilliant.
Well, you've got the best one we've ever heard, for whatever that's worth.
I play it a lot. I do. I love it. Now we come to the next amp on our list. This is the very first 6V6 amp. And this is, of course, the Deluxe 5E3, which is probably the most famous amp of all time. Anybody who's ever fell in love with a Fender amp has probably fallen in love with a FE3 for the first, you know, when they first heard it. This is about lo-fi as you can get. And this is you have to understand, like when you look at everybody who built stomp boxes or overdrives, they're basically trying to emulate the sound you get out of this 5E3. It's nothing else in the world sounds like a 5E3 Deluxe. This thing, I think when you talk about the circuitry, it's really it's basically got the cathode bias 6V6s, the Cathodyne PI. It's got the rectifier, the 5Y3A rectifier, the 12-inch, the P12R, you know, but it's amazing that people ask me, are people really paying as much money for these as it says in the book? And that is absolutely true. People are paying over $8,000 for these little Deluxes now. But these have incredible returns. If you invest in one, many years ago, you saw about 7% a year return. So, do you like that 5E3? Is that deluxe an amp you love?
Too small for my ears.
Right. So you're not a lead guitarist then.
It don't I like it clean.
And you don't stay clean very long.
That's right.
When you turn that, yeah. If you think about, the 1957 when somebody showed up at the studio with that deluxe, and he turned it up past 4, the producer or the engineer probably said, hey, back that thing down, He didn't know that that'd be the sound of rock and roll, a few years later. That's for sure. So, but I love that deluxe. I absolutely love that deluxe.
Talk about sustain with tone. That's got it.
Yep. The compression, it's just that's a magical amp. And I tell anybody, I know that they're very expensive now, but if you can get one, you can find one. You can even build one. I think, if you're an amp kit guy, or there's so many people that build the 5E3s, just get one for your collection just to play it. It's an incredible amp. It's a very fun amp. It's the perfect lead guitar blues amp. So,
yeah,
definitely. Now, I know the next one is one that you actually have. I think you still have it, is the Blonde Twin, the 6G8A. This is, now these things go for about $8,000 now. You like this amp. I know that.
Yes. The 212s. And that amp is about, what, 50, 60 watts?
80 watts. It could be 80 watts because it has the fixed bias long tail PI. Uses 4 5881s.
Well, I owned that amp for many, many years, and it was another one of those, looked like it just came from the factory. I can't remember if it had, I know it ended up with JBLs.
Right. It probably came with a 12M6 Oxford speaker. I think those what came in them originally.
It was beautiful to look at and beautiful to play through and listen to. And I finally sold it. It went to a collector that lives out in the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. And that one was featured in Vintage Guitar.
Right. Most of these, the ones that we've talked about, most of these have been featured in Vintage Guitar at one time or another. And now here's the one. This is always the holy grail for Fender collection, the next one in the list. This is the Brown Vibraburb 6G16. This is the first one with onboard reverb. This is a great amp here for collectors. Everybody wants to find these. And these, there's actually quite a few for sale out there. I'm always looking, but it's going to cost you over $8,000. And chances are they're not going to have the correct speakers in them. It's very hard to find these Brown Vibraburbs with the 10K5 ones in them, which were the original speakers. And I love the 10K5 ones. I love those speakers. And I think that's what gives that Vibraverb its signature sound, is that that speaker distortion.
Well, it's very much like what became the 210 Vibralux.
Right.
And I can't remember how or where I found it, but this was another museum piece. I must have traded for it, but I couldn't afford, what those things were worth, even 10 or 15 years ago. But that's another one that I had. It's serviced by Mike Clark and his buddy Steve Hunter, and that's in their top 3.
Yep.
Of all the amps they've ever heard and worked on. It's their top 3 is that Vibraverb.
Right. And anybody who listens to the Naked and Dimed or goes to the nakedanddimed.com website, that amp was featured on many rhythm tracks. We used that on at least 4 or 5 songs because it was so good. I didn't want to take it out of the amp room. And that thing has a distortion. People always ask me, would I rather have the Brown Vibraverb or the Vibralux Reverb? They're completely different amps. And it's mainly because of that, I think, the speaker distortion. But other than that, everything else, topology-wise, they're very similar amps. But the C10s and that Vibralux Reverb, they're a completely, that's another mind-blowing combination right there for sure. I think sound-wise, on the clean side, they both sound very, very similar. If you push them, that Vibraverb is going to distort very nicely.
That amp has been reproduced. Somebody commissioned Tech Steve Hunter in Athens, Georgia, to build a new version of a Brown Vibraverb, and it takes him quite a while. It's hand built.
Yep, that's a great. I know a lot of people build, there's a lot of kits out there for the 6G16. Great amps. I know that Fender actually reissued the amp in 2000s. But I've heard them. They don't really sound like the real thing. And that's one thing I want to touch on. I'll probably touch on it later, but as far as people always say, hey, does the 65 Deluxe Reverb reissue sound just like a real 65 Deluxe Reverb? And the answer is no. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll save that for later.
Okay.
As far as the next one on the list, as far as most valuable, this is the 1947 Dual Professional, which became the Super. This is the first 2x10 ever made. Up to then, everything was just a one speaker thing, but Leo Fender had extra 10-inch speakers sitting around. He came up with this great idea. And nowadays, to get a nice, all clean, all original Dual Professional, it's going to cost you $7,500, almost $8,000. But, I know Billy Gibbons loves them. I think he owns most of them that are known to be around. But truthfully, I've never played through one.
I don't think I've ever been around one in person, just pictures.
Yep. So I'll have to reserve any opinion I have. I would love to. If somebody out there has a nice one, call me. Now, the next one on this list is a very surprising one because this one has risen like a rocket in the last 5-6 years. And it's the Harvard 5F10. This is an amp that's completely different. This is a small 6V6 amp, but people are now getting over $7,000 for these amps. And these things have a 10% annual return right now. For the last 10 years, they've been returning about 10%. So if you bought one a few years ago, you're in good shape. But to buy one now, I don't know how much more it'll go. But this is a very unique amp. The Harvard, you had one. I remember that.
Yes, for a long time I had one, and it was another museum quality amp, and I can't remember why I ever got rid of it.
I know. I wish you still had it because then I would have it.
Well, it was small, and I don't gig through vintage amps anymore. I'll take them to the studio, if that's where they get a little bit of a workout. But that Harvard, it was famous for being the Steve Cropper sound on the
right
Booker T and the MGs. That was Steve Cropper playing through a Harvard.
Right, and that had a very interesting. As far as the circuitry, this is when for some reason they really switched things up here, and nobody knows why. Like they used a 6AT6, not a 12AY7 in the preamp. They used a single side triode, and that was the only time I think that I know that they did that. And they fixed biased the CV6s, which was something that really was done on the big amps, but it was this thing so this makes this Harvard is actually closer to that Brown Princeton than it is to the Deluxe, which was a sister, And this is a very unique amp, and if you can get one, if you can find one, I promise you'll never be unhappy with that thing. The only thing is they're very expensive now. They've actually jumped in price considerably in the last 5-6 years.
Well, I did not know that.
Now, the next amp on this list is one you're very familiar with, and that was the Brown Vibrolux, the 5F11. This is another great amp, but they're going to cost you about $6.5 now, $6.5K. But they have a great return. They actually have a better return than the stock market right now. Another great amp. I think that was most famous made. That was what they call the Sultan's a swing amp.
And they didn't make very many. That was a 61, 2, and maybe 3, 61 to 63. And low production numbers. You can't hardly find one of those.
Yep. And it brings in, that was one of the first amps to bring in the tremolo with the old school tremolo circuit. But that's a great amp. I love that amp. As you know, I just got it. Yeah, this is a great amp. This is like cosmetically, that Vibrolux is the best I've ever seen. And I love that amp. I use that right now. That's the one that's plugged into my Brown box. And if I go home today, I'm probably going to play through that amp. Whatever I pick off the wall, I'm going to play through that amp. I just love that amp.
Well, I'm glad it went to you.
And then the next one, this is one, so we're still about $6,000 amps here, is the Trommel X, the last of the Tweeds, F9A. And this is a one that also has added tremolo. This one had a 12-inch speaker, so it's closer to, I guess it's like a deluxe with the tremolo, whereas the Vibrolux was more like the Harvard with the tremolo.
Yeah.
This was a great amp. And there's 3 amps that when you play it for the first time, the hair on the back of your neck's going to stand up, and you're just going to go, wow. The first time you played through a deluxe, small deluxe, 59 deluxe, when you played the first time you played through Bandmaster, 59 Bandmaster, and the third one, I think, is when you play through that 6F9 with the EL84s. That one, you'll be like, whoa, that's an incredible, incredible amp. Very hard to find. I think they only made them for 1 year, and they had to discontinue and put in 6L6s because those things were getting so hot and they were catching on fire that they had to quickly turn. But that's the most martial sounding of any Fender amp.
I had many people try to talk me out of that amp, and I must have needed the money at some point because it was everything you described and immaculate.
Yep. It had the 10-inch speaker with the sound ring. Just incredible. It didn't last very long. They switched out that circuit pretty quick. But if you can find that original 61, that's a great amp. And then there's a few more amps that show up in the 5,000, 6,000 range. For some reason, now you're going to pay a lot of money for the Princetons, the 5F2s. And those are also small little 8-inch speakers. Those are great because everything is shifted. Everybody wants small Fender amps, and that's a good small Fender amp. And then the next amp on the list is the very first blackface amp. The most expensive blackface or black panel amp you're going to get is the 64 Vibroverb. This was the one that came with the 15-inch CTS speaker in it.
Yes.
And I guess some came with JBLs also, the D130Fs in them also. Or I think people just put 130F JBLs in them.
I owned one of those. And it was one of the few of my vintage amps that I ever took to a gig, to play in a ballroom kind of a thing, and didn't like it.
Right.
It's just something about it. It didn't have the presence. It didn't have the brightness. And it was like, that's a beautiful amp and everything's working perfectly.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't sound right.
People don't realize that the Caesar Diaz mods that Stevie, because Stevie Ray Vaughan was famous for playing that black Vibroverb and the black Super Reverb, they were modded heavily. The rectifiers were changed, the transformers were changed. I do not own, this is absolute truth, I do not own a blackface Vibroverb, and I don't own one because way back, many, many years ago, I had a long talk with John Peden, and he told me that I wouldn't like it, because he knew what I liked. I bought my deluxe, my 5E3 from him, and we talked all the time about amps, and I asked him, like, should I look for this 64 Vibroverb? And he told me no. He goes, you wouldn't like it. He goes, it's not the amp. It's not the kind of amp that suits the way you play. And he told me that, the blackface amp that would make you the happiest is the Pro Reverb, that Pro Reverb. And that's true. That's true. As far as the 6L6 amps are concerned, that Pro Reverb is a crazy amp that nobody knows about. For $2,000, you can get an amp that's just as good as any other big blackface amp. I tell people that all the time. Look for Pro Reverbs. That's the secret. Pro Reverbs.
Yep, and I have one, and it gets used. And great amp.
Right.
There's something about, I want to back up just a minute to that Tremolux, that first 6G9 with the 210s.
Yeah.
And it was a piggyback. And I did a speaker, listened to several different kinds of speakers in that amp one afternoon. And it finally came alive when I put a pair of JBL 10-inch speakers in it. Nothing, Aldecos, ceramics, Jensen's. I changed speakers, but when those JBLs went in there, that was it.
Right.
Now it's a good sounding amp. Just thought I would throw that out because I think they get a bad rap because of those tubes. But not only that, they didn't sound good until I put those JBLs in there.
Right.
For whatever it's worth.
Right. So so we get to the bottom here as far as amps. When we talk about Fender amps that you could put in your collection, there's a lot of amps, Fender amps that are now selling a little bit below 5,000, from about 4.5 to 5,000. And I tell people these are the greatest amps, and you should get them now while you can, because they will climb a little bit. I think the amps we talked about earlier, the ones that are at 10,000, I think they're going to stay around 10,000 always. There's a 40-40 rule that's still in play. It's that anything over 40 pounds or 40 watts is not as desirable as anything that's under 40 watts or 40 pounds. And the things that are under 40, the small amps are the ones that are rising, whereas the big ones just kind of stay where they are. But as far as amps, I recommend that you can find that will be about $4,000, a little over $4,000. The Brown Bandmaster, the TV Front Deluxe. Now, it's very important that if you're a blues guy and you love deluxes, it's important to have one of those early TV fronts, because it has paraphase and phase inverter. It's got the octal preamp in it, and that's a completely different beast as far as gut-wrenching blues. I tell people, you play that 5E3 next to a 5A3, they're just a world of difference between the two, and you're going to love both. There's also the wide panel deluxe, the wide panel super, the wide panel Bandmaster, that Brown deluxe, the deluxe reverb. Everybody should own a deluxe reverb. The Showman 12, which is a beautiful, wonderful amp. Brown Tremolex, Brown Vibrolux, the wide panel Pro, Blonde Bassman, Vibrolux reverbs. These are all amps you can get in the $4,000 to $5,000 range. Great amps. Is there any amp in there that you love most of all?
It's hard to just pick one. To record, well, I'll say this. The best all around, take it to the studio, play it on a gig, is that Pro Reverb.
Right, Pro Reverb. Absolutely.
It's just got it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's versatile. You can drive it hard. You can play it clean. It's
a 2x12, but a tiny little output transformer. So that thing saturates immediately. So, people say, oh, it's 2x12. It's going to give you that Fender Twin reverb. No, this is not a Fender Twin reverb. This thing saturates quickly. You can get to that sweet spot, very low volumes. Very great amp. Great rock and roll amp, for sure.
Well, I happened to find one that a friend of mine owned, and he wanted more than I was willing to pay. For years, I tried to talk him out of it, and finally I got it. Mm-hmm. And it's another one of those, looks like it just came from the factory.
You told me something very interesting, that when you restore some of these post-CBS Fender amps, you make sure that you put in Allen Bradley resistors. Why is that?
Because they're more reliable. If you're going to play it a lot, they last longer. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what it does for the sound, but I know that Michael Clark and Steve Hunter both swear by them.
Right.
That's one of the first things they will do is replace them, even if they're still good. But put those Allen Bradleys in there, and they've never let me down.
Right, and that's the big difference, I think. Pre-65, every blackface amp has the Allen Bradleys. Post-66, you're going to have a mixture of the two. They made, I guess, in Jamaica, they made these resistors. And then by 67, there's no more Allen Bradleys. So
my Pro Reverb was about 60% pre-CBS, and and I had Steve Hunter, to make it 100%. And I had forgotten about that. Yeah, that's a CBS thing, and I don't know why they did that. Mm-hmm. The cost, I guess.
Yeah, like everything. Once the bean counters were in there. Now and I'm going to end this list with the best amps you can get for under $4,000 or under 4.5K. And that's going to be the Blonde Bandmaster, the Champ. That Champ is a Champ. The Brown Princeton, which everybody knows that's my favorite amp. When I talk about what's the amp, a Brown Princeton. I have a lot of favorites, but that's my favorite little amp. It goes up there with the Deluxe, the little Deluxe. It used to be that the Brown Princeton was half the price of a Deluxe, not anymore. Princeton Reverb, of course, which is a great amp. Concert, Super Reverb, Silver Deluxe Reverbs, Pro Reverb, Blackface Tremolux. Let me say something about that Super Reverb. if I could gig and I had a roadie that would always bring my stuff in for me, I didn't have to carry it, I would gig with a Super Reverb because that's one of my favorite all-time amps. It has everything you could ever want in an amplifier, and that Super Reverb is a great amp, and you could get them still for $2,000 to $2,500, and I don't know. I think everybody should have a Super Reverb, or at least play through a Super Reverb. That was really when you think of the ultimate blackface sound and amp, that's definitely one. That Pro Reverb, Super Reverb, that's all you need. Well, and then the Princeton Reverb. And then the Deluxe Reverb. You might as well have that one too. And then add, you really do need that blackface Trumbull X also. So I don't know. It's hard. You can't just pick one. There's no two Fender amp models are the same. It's amazing. We went through quite a few here that range from price from $20,000 all the way down to about $3,000, and no two are the same. They're all magical in some way, Well,
then it comes down to if you only had one, which one would you pick?
Right. And
my vote goes to that blackface Pro Reverb.
Right. And that's important to point out to everybody. That's an amp that cost half of what the black Vibrolux or the black Vibroverb costs. So that's a great amp. And that's the secret's out. Now everybody's going to start buying them, I think. But if you can find them, I guarantee them. People talk about reissue amps versus real amps. One of the things is when I first started doing the vintage price guide, I started calling around, everybody was kind of skeptical. They thought that Fender or the vintage amps in particular had their day. They're like, nobody's going to really invest in or play through vintage amps. Not while there's all these new sampling amps that come out. You can play through a sampling amp or a modeling amp that sounds just like a Super Reverb. And people say, well, you would never be able to tell on that record that if I was using a modeling amp or a real Super Reverb. Maybe that's true. But if you're standing in the room, standing in front of that amp, it's real when you're playing through a Super Reverb. And do you find that, have you played through a lot of reissue Fender amps?
No, not a lot.
Not a lot.
Occasionally, somebody will bring one to the studio, and we'll dial in whatever sounds best for that the song that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you from experience, like when I was gigging, I did maybe 100 shows, 200 shows with a Psychedelic Mooj with a Fender 65 Deluxe Reverb reissue. Great amp, great sounding amp. It was perfect for my sound, but I was using an overdrive pedal with it, and I was using a mod, like a wah-wah pedal.
Yeah.
But when I got that 64 Deluxe Reverb, and I plugged it in for the first time, I was blown away by how much different that amp was. And it was like I was getting, like, the distortion was coming from the tubes. The warm distortion was coming from the tubes and the speaker, that Oxford speaker that's on those original Deluxe Reverbs. Great speaker. I know people switch them out all the time. I'm like, no, yeah, that original Oxford is incredible on that amp. That's what colors it. And so that's what, and then there's also they talk about hand wired. They talk about paralytic capacitance that comes from these large circuit boards, not the compressed, discrete, everything's put on a chip type thing. There was just something magical about cloth covered wire and long wires that feed up and through, and you come back and you have real capacitors, these big electrolytic capacitors next to each other. And then you have the resistors underneath them and next to them. And you have, just, you can't emulate that. Yeah, the circuit is identical. If you did a circuit modeler, you get the signal looks just the same with the reissue because it's modeled to be exactly the same as far as the characteristics are. But your ear knows there's a big difference between the reissue and the original thing. So it's important that vintage Fender amp, well, until recently, but vintage amps in particular aren't crazy. They actually are strikeable. You could actually gig with these things. You can pay for what you would pay for a boutique amp. You could actually buy a vintage amp and gig with it and keep it maintained. And it will be the best sounding amp you could ever imagine. There's something magical about gigging with a real vintage amp.
I agree.
So, well, that's good, Tommie. I thank you for your time. Anything else that we didn't cover that you'd want to throw out there?
Well, just that those vintage amps were handmade. I mean, by different people.
Right.
And somebody could pick up a handful of parts, and it'll sound different than the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And, wire, the quality of the wire, the length of the wire, the quality of the solder. I mean, think about all of those people that Fender hired to wire those amps. Those girls like Loopy,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote her name on that little piece of masking tape.
Right. And that's most collectors will still have that masking tape. They will not remove that masking tape. It's important to know that Loopy made that amp, we collect all the names, I think Loopy has made most of my amps. I love seeing the name Loopy in my amp on that piece of masking tape.
But for cost reasons, over time and technology and, machines are now doing a lot of that work. And I think maybe the hand wiring explains the reason that they don't all sound exactly the same.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a thing, and I tell people all the time, like 80% of your tone comes from your amp. People think, oh, the guitar. I play this guitar. I play that guitar. No, if you're a tone purist, most of your tone and color is coming from your amp, and it's very important that your amp, give you what you want, and that's you're going to find it with a Fender amp for sure. And no two are alike, no two models are alike, and that's the greatest adventure you'll have, is finding the perfect Fender amps as you go through life.
Well, I for one want to thank you for sharing your knowledge in the books and the recordings that you have for sale, and I've learned a lot from you. And continue to learn every time we talk.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you'll continue to share with us.
Oh, yes. And I should point out, Tommie, that most of what I know is what you taught me.
Well, now you and I know that's not true, because you've got some great amps and you've been a great customer, but you've done more than just play them. You've tried to understand them.
Right. And that's the thing. I love these amps more than anything. And it's, I can't quantify. I can just tell you the feel. I can't tell you why this and that. It's just the magical addition of all the components together that gives you something special. And that's why certain amps, like that high power Twin and that very low power Harvard, there's just something crazy that nobody designed and to be like that. It just happened that way. It was just the magical components that somehow combined to make something crazy. So,
well, you might want to try this sometime. I came across an orphaned Tremolux head, blonde Tremolux, and I think that would be a model 6G. It was a piggyback head,
yeah,
which would have had 210s.
Mm-hmm.
I took the chassis out. I had Greg Hopkins, who's a great friend and a cabinet maker. He's written Ampeg books. He's a bass player, good friends with Jess Oliver. I had him make me a 210 combo cabinet, and we put the chassis from that 210 Tremolux into a 210 combo cabinet, and you won't believe how good that sounds.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's just awesome. And I'm a big fan of something else. We could make a whole show to talk about the 6G6 Bassman,
right,
evolution, and the last one that they made before CBS took over had as a 6G6C.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned that, and they just Vintage Guitar Magazine just featured that, I think last August.
I think it was November of 20.
November, okay.
November.
So I invite people to read that article. That's a very interesting article. I know that you were contacting Dave Hunter about that particular amp, and he said, I think he waited a while, and then he finally did that. And that's one of those rare Easter egg type amps,
But I've put that chassis into a 210, two 210s like I did the Tremolux,
mm-hmm.
and you won't believe how good that sounds.
Yep.
I mean, that's not something that Fender ever did. And I'm sure somebody else, I'm not the only one that's ever done that, but boy, those are two of my favorite amps. I mean, sound-wise, to play them, to hear them, mm-hmm. just awesome. And that vintage amp, that Bassman amp, we didn't talk a lot about those. But Fender was trying, it was the 6G6, and then it was the 6G6A and B, mm-hmm. and they were trying to make a better bass amp. Well, the 6G6C, which never made it onto the tube charts, is probably the best one. The sound of it is the best one.
And I know they didn't make a lot of them.
No, it was very short-lived because it was, they had white knobs and had a presence control on the far right. They did away with that. The model AA864, which came out in, I think, October of '64, just before they sold to CBS. All of those amps are great sounding amps for guitars.
So look for them, people. Look for them. All right, Tommie, I'm gonna let you go. Thank you again for your time. This was a lot of fun. We just like we always do, just sit and talk amps on the telephone. We just did it and recorded it this time. So,
well, thank you for including me in this series.
I just enjoy talking amps with you. And when I did this amp show, I just wanted to be with you because you and I, this is what we talk about often. And you amassed an incredible collection. A lot of it, I was lucky that is now part of my collection. So.
Well, I'm glad they found a home with you.
Yes, I enjoy them every day, and I play them. As you know, I have a maintenance program where they all have to be played 1 hour a month. So that's a lot. That's a lot of guitar playing. So thank you again, Tommie. Thank you so much.
Okay, Bill, and thank you.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. If you have any questions you want to ask about all the podcasts we're putting up or podcasts you want to hear in the future, send me an email at ram@vintageguitar.com. I'll answer any of your questions. I'll fit these questions in with the shows we're doing. We had a great feedback about shows people want to hear or topics to be discussed, and we're going to try to start addressing those as we go from here. Any message you want to send me, ram@vintageguitar.com. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment on this podcast.